right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Yael Aronoff, who's presenting on Israeli-Palestinian peace. Dr. Yael Aronoff is the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel and is the Serling Chair in Israel Studies at Michigan State University. She is also professor of international relations at James Madison College. Dr. Aronoff's book, The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers When Hardliners Opt for Peace, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and she co-edited a book with Dr. Ilan, Peleg, and Dr. Saliba Sarsar, apologies if I didn't pronounce those correctly, entitled Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond Lexington Books, 2021. She has given over 100 public lectures and is a lecturer in the Association of Jewish Studies Distinguished Leadership Program and in the Association of Israel Studies Distinguished Lectureship Program. So with that, I will hand it off to you, Dr. Aronoff. It looks like we might not be able to hear things in the People's Church.
So I don't know, did no one hear me? No. Okay, so I'll start again. Sorry about that. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for inviting me. I spoke at the People's Church a couple previous times a few years ago. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. I tend to talk for about half the time that we have, and then have open it up for questions and answers and discussion. It's kind of a really challenging time right now with Israelis and Palestinians, with the peace process having stagnated for years, with there being violence almost on a weekly, daily basis. And so it's an extremely challenging time. So what I'm going to do is walk through with you a little bit previous frameworks and plans for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a two-state solution and previous negotiations that the Israelis and Palestinians have engaged in to give us a framework for possible future solutions and gaps that were narrowed in the past. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges today, both in terms of public opinion polling among Israelis and Palestinians, violence that's occurring on the ground. And then, because I'm an eternal optimist, I'm also going to look forward and see whether there are conditions that could change that might provide us opportunities to return to those frameworks for negotiations in the future. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint. Just going to share my screen. Okay. It still says host disabled participant screen sharing. So now it's good. Okay. Share screen. All righty. Great. Okay. All right. So the framework that I always use in talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a framework of right versus right, as opposed to right versus wrong. That doesn't mean that one party or another isn't doing wrong things at the moment, but it just means that generally speaking, both are nationalist movements and have the legitimacy of being national movements that are seeking their self-determination. And in that sense, what I often assign to my students is a chapter called Right versus Right by Amos Oz, who was a famous Israeli novelist and peace activist who died a couple of years ago. And he has a tiny book, literally this big, that's called How to Cure a Fanatic. And in it, he has a chapter saying right versus right. And he compares this kind of a Greek tragedy in that you don't, in that both sides have really legitimate concerns and legitimate claims. And that's what makes it even more challenging. And so when I start this, especially with students, and I know there's some students with us as well, but for everyone, is that people have very strong opinions about this, and that often the conflict describes one side or the other as kind of monolithic, even demonizes one side or the other. And so when actually there's a lot of diversity of opinions, among Palestinians, among Israelis. And so we really want to look at the complexities of this as much as we can, as we would in an academic environment, rather than kind of trying to oversimplify a conflict. And often when people have never been to the area or don't know as much about the conflict, it's easier to rely on kind of oversimplifications and even to veer into demonization. So I try to resist that, and that's kind of the framework that I use. Sometimes people are unfamiliar with the map. So moving forward, I'm not going to start, for lack of time this evening at the beginning of the conflict, but I'm going to start post 1967 war. So Israel before 1948 had the boundaries that you see here in white. And then after the 67 war, it captured during the war, the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria up north, and the Sinai as well from Egypt. In 1978-79, it had a peace agreement with Egypt in which it returned the Sinai to Egypt for the Egyptian-Israeli peace that has lasted over 3 decades since. But the main conflict that we're looking at, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is one in which you have Israel occupying the West Bank, which some religious Israelis call Judea and Samaria. And it's still, Israel and Egypt control the borders of the Gaza Strip. So even though Israel evacuated all its settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip in summer of 2005, there's still control of the borders. And so when we're the framework that the dominant framework that has been used to try to think of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to allow for 2 states in which both Palestinians and Israelis will have a right to self-determination in their own countries. And so when you look at that framework, as we'll be looking at through most of our time here together, part of that is a land for peace agreement in which a Palestinian state would be created in the vast majority of the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, with a connection between the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And there have been lots of negotiations of that include overland highways, on the ground roads, and tunnels. And often what you see is formulas that are based on the 67 borders with land swaps. And that's often the formula that's used. And if you look at the map, let's say Israel kept the Jewish quarter in the Old City that has the Western Wall and a couple Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, again, belonged to Jordan before 1967. Then the idea would be that Israel would have to swap it with other territory pre-1967, so in that white area, for the full kind of value equivalent size of the land to Palestine. So the formula in negotiations has been between the Palestinian Authority and Israel has been 1967 borders with land swaps, and that's kind of the formula. And I know that's a little confusing for some people, but as we go through it, maybe you'll have a better sense of it, and we can always return to the map if you have questions. But please, if you have a question, don't hesitate to to stop me, and I'll go ahead and talk and explain. So again, the dominant framework for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been the two-state solution. I have TSS for the two-state solution. That's been the formula kind of even pre the establishment of Israel in 1948 with the Peel Commission of the United Nations. Their formula was again kind of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state, as what they thought of as the most desirable, given the research they had done on the ground. And then when you had, and I'm skipping to the Oslo negotiations in 1993, that led to the Oslo Accords in 1993 and 1995. Many of you probably remember the images in the White House Rose Garden with Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, where they signed the Oslo I Accords in 1993. And so that, for the first time, broke the taboo of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization not recognizing each other, not recognizing each other as national movements. And so they both recognized each other, accepted the framework of a two-state solution, and had a bunch of steps that were supposed to increase trust between the parties that then would allow them to discuss very divisive ideas such as what to do with Jerusalem, how to what to do with Palestinian refugees, and so forth, right? And so those were postponed for discussion. And what the Oslo II did was introduce, in a sense, a quasi-Palestinian government to the West Bank called the Palestinian Authority. So Arafat returned, he was elected as president with enormous, huge numbers. Legislative branch was established, a judicial branch was established, a parliamentary branch was established. And so you have the beginnings of the institutions of a state, but it was not a peace agreement. It was actually a process that was supposed to lead to the peace agreement. And initially it had a lot of success. And then after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a young extremist religious Jewish Israeli, in November of 1995, that was one of the things that disrupted, that process. You had other disruptions of spoilers on both sides who opposed a process that would lead to a two-state solution, which include religious settlers on the West Bank on the Israeli side, and included Hamas, a different political party than Fatah, who was part of the Palestinian Authority, who agreed to a two-state solution, who still opposed the process toward a two-state solution and used violent means to try to spoil that. So you had all these factors. Spoilers on both sides had time to galvanize opposition to this peace process. So often, rather than trust being built, which it was built in the first couple of years, that trust started to erode for lots of reasons. So I'm kind of giving a very short version of that. So the legitimacy of this framework was also supported by a majority of Israelis over the 25 years or so supporting that framework of a two-state solution in multiple polls. At times you had majority Palestinian support. At other times you had plurality support. So even when it went under 50%, it still had more Palestinians supported a two-state solution in polls than they did a one-state solution or other kinds of alternatives. And we can talk about that in the discussion as well. A lot of peace negotiations took place, thousands of hours of time among negotiators, thousands of pages, which narrowed gaps as to what this might look like in the future. And by the way, these negotiators became friends over the years. Many of them, they went to each other's children's weddings and things like that. And even though it wasn't hegemonic, you always had people who disagreed with it. It received a significant amount of support relative to other alternatives, and also had almost hegemonic support in the international community. So if you look at the United Nations, the European Union, the Arab League since 2002, Russia, and the United States, of course, they've all, since those early 1990s until today, supported very strongly the idea of a two-state, a peace agreement that would establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel. And that has been the framework for resolving the conflict. So in 2000, you had, after kind of the deterioration of this peace process that I outlined, you had an effort by President Bill Clinton to bring Arafat to Camp David, to bring the Israeli Prime Minister Barak to Camp David, and they spent at least 10 days trying to negotiate say, okay, let's now talk about Jerusalem for the first time. Let's now talk about Palestinian refugees for the first time. Let's now talk about where the border is going to be. And so he kind of put his parameters on the table. There were some hesitations on both sides. And I think he made the mistake of then taking it off the table. It came back in a few months later in the 2001 Taba negotiations, and has more or less been a framework since then for resolving the conflict. And so what did Bill Clinton do and his team? They said, well, Israel wants to keep maybe 5-6% of the West Bank because that's where most of its settlers are. So Israel has lots of settlements in the West Bank, but most of the people in those settlements live in a few blocks, 3 to 4 blocks. Some of them have 80,000 people that are often 10 minutes from Jerusalem, and people live there mostly for economic reasons, not necessarily religious reasons. So they're saying, okay, if we keep these blocks, Israel is saying, we won't have to evacuate most of the settlers. We'll evacuate most of the settlements, some of them in the middle of the West Bank, but some of those settlements have 500 people or 1,000 people. They don't have where most of the people are. So they're saying if we keep a little bit of it, we'll swap the rest. Palestine is saying, look, you're already getting most of the land of the original Palestine mandate. Therefore, we really want you to keep as little of the West Bank as possible, which is also understandable. So they were talking about 1%, 2% that Israel might keep, and then swap that. And so what Bill Clinton did is say, hey, this land where the border is resolvable, right? You're basically differing between Israel keeping maybe 2% of the West Bank or 6% of the West Bank. So let's start there. Let's not start the negotiations from scratch. Let's start where we have that gap, which is much smaller. And that's eminently resolvable, right? And then what he said is, okay, there's 2 different issues that are much harder to resolve. And that's Jerusalem and refugees, right? And so, obviously Jerusalem is important to, millions and millions of people around the world of the 3 monotheistic religions. But for Jews, it's the number 1 holy site. Synagogues face Jerusalem. Religious Jews pray there 3 times a day. They had 2 temples there, and so forth. And they weren't allowed when Jordan controlled East Jerusalem from 48 to 67. No Jew, whether they were Israeli or American or from anywhere else, was allowed to go to the Jewish quarter or pray at the Western Wall, which is the supporting wall of the old temple. That's the Wailing Wall, Western Wall. And so therefore some Israelis are more concerned about, okay, if they don't have sovereignty over the parts of East Jerusalem, will they also be barred as they were in the past from praying freely, and many Israelis want to keep it. So, and Palestinian refugees, right? And of course, it's important to Palestinians. It's the 3rd most holiest Muslim site. They're beautiful, right? Mosques on the Temple Mount. 13% or so of Palestinians are Christian. They have important sites in Jerusalem. And you could imagine when you're going to have such a small country, the Palestinians are going to have the symbolic value also of having it for your national identity, and having tourists from all over the world come is important as well. So obviously Jerusalem is important to both. And then of course, refugees are very important to Palestinians. In 1948, about 750,000 Palestinians left, right? The original Israeli narrative was that they just opted to leave of their own will, not because all of a sudden you want to move, but because 5 armies had attacked Israel. You have a lot of violence between 6 different armies and Palestinians. So you think you're going to flee and be able to come back 2 weeks later, thinking that Palestinians, with the aid of Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Jordan, would be able to beat the Jewish forces at that time. And the Palestinian narrative was everyone that was forced out. The truth, as it often is, if you look at archival evidence, is often in between. So it seems like 150,000 at least were forced out, whereas most left, but thinking they could come back. But, people can talk about those numbers. But anyway, the point is that Palestinians have a sense of these refugees, if they want to, should be able to return to the original Israel. So what Clinton does is say, okay, I'm going to have a trade-off between these 2 issues. And so Israel, you're going to have to concede most of East Jerusalem. And in return, Palestinians, you're going to have to concede the implementation, at least, of the right of return to Israel itself, because if all Palestinians theoretically went to Israel, over time, as they had more kids, Jews would no longer be the majority in the Israeli state. And then Israelis would feel like they would lose their self-determination. And from their point of view, you could potentially have three Palestinian states, right? The Palestinian state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Then Israel would essentially turn into a Palestinian state with the shifts in demographics over time. And now the Palestinian population in Jordan is sometimes people say about half, so eventually could become a majority as well. So in any case, Clinton says the right of return for refugees is largely going to be to the new Palestinian state in the West Bank, most of East Jerusalem and Gaza with the connection. A few will be able to have family reconnections or get asylum elsewhere. They'll get several billions of dollars of economic compensation for property loss and so forth. But that's the trade-off within the Clinton parameters that's essentially existed in several of the previous negotiations after that. So, and in the old city, you have the Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, and Armenian quarter. And basically Israel would be able to keep the Jewish quarter, and the Muslim and Christian quarters would go to the Palestinian state. So, and the same thing, the Palestine would control Haram al-Sharif, where the two mosques are, and Israel would control the Western Wall or Wailing Wall. And Israel would acknowledge partial responsibility for the suffering of the Palestinian refugees because of some of them had been forced out from the military. They don't assume full responsibility because they're saying we were attacked by 5 countries. There wouldn't be refugees had there been no war and no attack. But that's a different story. That's one thing. They would be acknowledgement of partial responsibility. So then in the Taba negotiations in 2001, as you can see, that's kind of a framework. And you can see how much was discussed for percentages of land of Israel that would be kept, but it's essentially very much based on the Clinton parameters. And that's what Israeli and Palestinian negotiators were negotiating in January 2001 in Taba, Egypt. And so they were narrowing the gaps and getting closer. Then you have Saudi Arabia in 2002 that came up with its own peace plan. And originally they said, okay, we're for 2 states. The Palestinian state will be on the 67 border. And then since 2013, the Arab League has been sanctioning this and said on 67 border with swaps. So they acknowledge that Israel may be able to keep Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, a couple blocks outside, and then swap the rest. So the Arab League has acknowledged that. Again, East Jerusalem as its capital, a Palestinian state, just and agreed upon resolution to refugees, which means it has to be just, but it has to be agreed upon, which means essentially not all refugees will be able to return to Israel because Israel has to agree on the number. So Saudi Arabia tried to have a compromise between the two. So I'm kind of taking too long, so I'm going to rush through this. One of the last kind of negotiated offers, and none of these things are formal and are contested in different accounts, but was by Prime Minister Olmert in 2008, where he again bases on the Clinton parameters, but makes the most generous offer of any Israeli government up to that point, which when he offers, okay, there'll be a Palestinian state. Israel would keep, as you see, around 6%, 5.8%. It would swap the rest with pre-1967 territory and a connection between Gaza and the West Bank. There would be very limited family unification of refugees, and most of East Jerusalem would become the capital of the Palestinian state, with a sharing of joint administration by US, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, now for a host of reasons, which I could get into, this has kind of collapsed and stagnated, partially because of parties like Hamas that have tried to foil it, and also during the Second Intifada, there was a lot of violence with 1,000 Israelis, mostly civilians, having suicide bombings within Israel and buses and restaurants and so forth, which unfortunately kind of weakened the center left in Israel that supported these peace negotiations, and Israel retaliated and tried to find the people responsible, killing about 3,000 Palestinians in return. So every Israeli and every Palestinian knows someone who was killed during the Second Intifada, and that violence, amongst many other factors, contribute to a deterioration of trust. So there are many challenges, therefore, since then, and it's kind of most acute today, to this framework of a two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians. So if you look at the polls of Israeli and Palestinian public opinion, whereas just in 2016, 51% of Palestinians supported a two-state solution, in December 2022, which is the latest poll I could find, it dropped to 32%, given the stagnation, the peace process, given the new Israeli government that was likely to be formed after the election in December 2022. They didn't see prospects in the near term of getting to a two-state solution. Israeli support has also declined, where it was, let's say, 50% for two states in 2021, dropped to 39%, dropped to now today or in September. People kind of knew what the new government might look like, didn't think with a new government, the new Israeli government is the most right and religious government in Israel's history. They didn't think the prospects would be good for two states, and therefore support has gone down that it's going to happen nearby. So you have a weakening of the legitimacy for this among Israelis and Palestinians. I'm going to talk more about the Israeli government and the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas face kind of legitimacy challenges as well, which I don't have time to get into. But these things combined really challenge kind of the legitimacy for this formula that's existed for so many years. Right. Additional challenges are, of course, Hamas control of Gaza since 2007, which opposes this two-state framework, a continuing weakening of the Palestinian Authority. So in the December 2022 poll, support for satisfaction with President Abbas was at 23% among Palestinians, and 75% wanted him to resign. I mean, he's been president for, over 15 years. There haven't been elections and there's some corruption. Then you have the current Israeli government, as I said, the most right-wing government in Israeli history. There were 5 elections in the past 4 years in Israel because it's such an extremely polarized society, so that often it's very hard in a parliamentary democracy to form a coalition, right? You never have in Israel, like you have in the United States, 50% or more of people voting for president, and that's who wins, right? You often have 28% to 30% of people voting for a prime minister. You never get to the majority. So Netanyahu, that's what Netanyahu got this time too. The majority of Israelis have voted against, have not voted for Netanyahu in the past 5 elections. But he was able to form a coalition with these other right parties. And one of his main incentives for creating this is that he's been under indictment for the last 3 years for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And so he's trying to form a coalition which will weaken the authority of the high court in Israel, so that the Israeli Knesset, which has 120 members with just 61 members voting, can overturn the high court saying something is against Israel's quasi-constitution. Like England, it doesn't have an actual constitution. It has 14 basic laws. But right now, you can't, with a simple majority, override the high court. They're trying to do that, among other things, but one of Netanyahu's main motives is his own political survival and trying to potentially stay out of jail himself for the indictments against him, which has resulted in this kind of government, which is extremely challenging to try to get to two-state solution. Many of the parties are opposed to it, want to annex parts of the West Bank and so forth. And you don't have, so all these things are serious challenges to this. If you look in 2019, there was still more hope in the sense that Even though support for two states has gone down, you still have a significant portion that say we'd rather have that than one state, etc. If you go to the current polls in December 2022, there's still only 26% of Palestinians who support one state and 71% oppose that. So even though the legitimacy for two states has really gone down, there are still a plurality of Israelis and Palestinians even today who support a two-state solution above a one-state solution. And as I said, it remains almost hegemonic in the international community. I'm going to skip over this because I want to leave time for discussion. I'm basically showing here that there's still relative legitimacy for the two-state solution, that the right in Israel, often 36% of them now support one form or another of two states. The visions of how the Palestinians who support one state and the Jewish Israelis who support one state, their vision of what one state would look like differs dramatically, right? So, and there's never been negotiations over one state, and there haven't been often official parties, many official parties who have supported it. So there's even kind of more, much wider gaps in terms of what that would look like. The current situation, as I alluded to, is very bad and very dangerous. If you look at the current Israeli government, you have in the coalition a block of two smaller parties, which are ultra-nationalist, which are racist, and which are extremely dangerous. So one of them, Ben Gvir, he really seeks to kind of provoke violence and incite it in some ways. He's against kind of restraining the military code of ethics and the police code of ethics. He wants to have them to show less restraint against Palestinians. Really horrifically, there was a Jewish Israeli, Baruch Goldstein, who in 1994 murdered 29 Palestinians as they were worshiping. And he had a picture of him in his office until, for the 6 years after that, seeing him as, just gives me chills to even think about it, talk about it, seeing him as some kind of hero, right? So this is kind of who now, shockingly, is in the government, and I would argue would never be in the government if it weren't for Netanyahu and his own political survival, because Netanyahu tried to boost him. And also he capitalized in a populist way over social media. In May 2021, there was escalated conflict between Israel and Hamas, which led to some intercommunal conflict.
I went over all of this with Steve this morning, but
and so if everyone can mute themselves,
yeah, but he clearly wasn't paying attention.
Soon we'll get to the Q&A.
Maybe he was still asleep.
So
I am.
If everyone can mute themselves, so then he's a very dangerous. He was under surveillance by Israeli intelligence. So if he goes to the Temple Mount, as he did, to kind of lay a stake and provoke things, now that's a whole different discussion. You could argue if there wasn't such a heightened conflict, Jews should be able to go and pray at the Temple Mount, which is the holiest of holiest to them, etc. But given the political situation, it's just pragmatically a very provocative thing to do, and he did that. A combination of these things, provide a tinderbox to potential violence, and I'm concerned that it could lead to a third intifada, to intercommunal violence within Israel, and it's a scary situation. A host of conditions have also led to increased support among Palestinians for the use of violence. So you have this combination of this provocateur in the Israeli government, a very right government, and now polls among Palestinians, because this, again, differs given the time period where now you have 55, this is from a December 2022 poll, 55% of Palestinians support a return to the armed intifada, compared to 21% who support negotiations and 23% support peaceful popular resistance. 50% of Palestinians support armed attacks against Israeli civilians, and 46 oppose that. More than 70% of the Palestinian public supports groups such as Lion's Den. They were established in the past year in the West Bank to kind of combat the occupation, and sometimes they're shooting at soldiers. Other times they are doing things within Israel. And the vast majority, over 87%, don't want the Palestinian Authority to intervene or to disarm them, right? So you have Hamas with its thousands of rockets, you have the Palestinian Authority that had security cooperation with Israel and is trained by the United States, but now it's losing kind of its authority over the use of violence even within the West Bank, right? So that's, the combination of these things is a pretty dangerous situation. So I don't want to leave us with that, because even though there's this potential for things to get much worse through things, I want to also kind of look forward in a more optimistic way. So I think in the long term, again, sooner or later, we're going to be returning to that framework. I think, I don't know, political scientists can't predict things, but my guess would be we return to the formula, and most settlements would be evacuated. Most of the settlements are pretty small. A plurality of populations still right now in a very bad situation support a two-state solution, and you still have the international community behind this formula. You also have alternative formulations going around. So also an idea of confederation. So two states, but within a confederation. So I brought to MSU in September 6 Israeli and Palestinian negotiators who had negotiated in previous negotiations, who have come up with this idea. They've written a 100-page document and they presented it together. They wrote kind of a narrative of Israeli-Palestinian history together. And it's on one hand based on the Geneva Accords. It's the Yossi Beilin and Dr. Hiba Husseini are the main architects of it, but there's about a dozen Israelis and Palestinians have contributed to it. It's very much based on that Clinton parameters, but it has some differences. And some of the differences are that you'd have many, many working groups. So it wouldn't be just a separation of the Palestinians in two states, but many, many working groups to kind of continue collaboration as opposed to just a divorce of the two populations. You'd have kind of more of a shared city phenomena within the old city that then would seek to expand kind of the shared use of that beyond the old city. And what's new here too, which is contentious and provocative, but interesting, is that in previous negotiations, most of the settlements would have to be evacuated, right? But in this confederation formula, settlers would have the choice of staying in the new Palestinian state. And if they stayed, they would be Israeli citizens, but it would have permanent residency in Palestine. And then the number of those who stayed, and who knows how many it would be. I suspect most wouldn't necessarily want to stay. So let's say 100,000 stay or 50,000 stay, then that number of Palestinian refugees could go to pre-1967 Israel, be Palestinian citizens, and be permanent residents of Israel. So the rationale for this is that it might make it more politically feasible to get to an agreement if you didn't have to battle, in a sense, these settlers that, even though they're a small proportion of the Israeli population, given a polarized society and the need to form a parliamentary coalition in a polarized society, they're often dependent on these small right parties. So that's part of the rationale. The danger, of course, is, there could be potential for violence between some settlers and Palestinians in a Palestinian state and so forth, or within Israel. But this is kind of the formula, and there'd be lots of measures to account for that. And then I'll conclude with some kind of looking to the future, what conditions can change that might again provide opportunities to move again towards this formula. So one idea, of course, is looking in the next 2 to 4 years, or possibly sooner, for new Israeli-Palestinian leadership and governments. And so right now, polls show that you have kind of equal percent of Palestinians who support Hamas and who support the Fatah party that is for a two-state solution, although many are kind of dissatisfied with both. But if you had Marwan Barghouti participate in an election, he would win 61% of Palestinian support versus Hamas's Hania. Now, Marwan Barghouti is a Fatah member who was part of the Tanzim in the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising from 2000 to 2005. So he, unlike Hamas, supports a two-state solution. But unlike Mahmoud Abbas during most of his prime ministership, was not opposed to targeting civilians within Israel in order to get greater concessions to reach a two-state solution. And he's been sitting in an Israeli jail for years since the Second Intifada, because there's evidence that he planned and participated in attacks against civilians. But if he was put on the ballot, and if Israel were to release him as part of a deal, this actually, I think, could be wonderful in terms of trying to reach a peace agreement, because he has the legitimacy and support to make the concessions that are required to reach a two-state solution. And he, unlike Hamas, supports a two-state solution, but unlike Abbas, has legitimacy and support in order to reach it. So that's kind of one idea that's probably not going to happen with the current Israeli government, but could happen potentially in the future. And then also in Israel, you could see a real backlash to the extremity of the current government that's not only kind of in danger of escalating violence with Palestinians, giving a couple of the ministers in there especially, but is a huge threat to Israel's democracy. And I think Israel's a hybrid democracy. It has elements of a liberal democracy, has elements of a consociational democracy. I can talk a little more about that. Has elements of an ethnic democracy. And if there's interest in discussion, I can talk more about that. But it's in real danger of completely losing the liberal part of its democracy if the government is passing these laws which would completely weaken the high court and therefore completely weaken safeguards for minorities in Israel that the high court protects and so forth. So right now in Israel, you have 100,000 people protesting, I think, every weekend. They're out there. And if you look at it in terms of what the population protesting would be in terms of the American population, it would be as if 3.3 million Americans were protesting every single weekend. So it's not just one demonstration at DC trying to get 3.3 million people there. It's again and again and again every weekend, and it doesn't seem to be letting up. So there's a lot of concern and opposition. You have the military who has come out with deep concern about the new government. You have the police that's come out in deep concern over the new government. You have the economists across the country who've come out strongly against it. You've had judges across the country who've come out strongly concerned about the new government. You have academic associations who've come out strongly concerned about the new government and its threats to democracy. So very much there could be a backlash where if this government lasts a year or two, in the next set of elections, you could potentially have the center left. The reason the right won this time is not because they necessarily had more votes than a year ago. What it is because the center left was divided. And so they didn't form a bloc, and they lost a lot of the votes for parties that couldn't pass the threshold needed to form a party. One of the Arab parties didn't pass the threshold because they weren't united. One of the leftmost Zionist party, Meretz, then passed the threshold. The opposite happened with these extreme right parties. They formed a bloc and they were able to pass the threshold. So it's not as if the numbers are permanently shifting in a linear fashion to extreme right governments, and it's very feasible that within the next couple of years, you get a government that is more amenable to reaching a resolution, and that has also Arab-Israeli parties in the coalition. The last government had such a party in the coalition. And if there's greater collaboration between the center left Jewish Israelis and Arab-Israeli parties, Palestinian parties, there is potential to move in that direction. And I'm closing here. But there's also kind of regional international factors that could assist. There's a great desire on the part of Israel and even the United States to expand the Abraham Accords that normalize relations between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan to include Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is more, wants more from Israel in regard to the Palestinians for normalization. And, that is something that can be leveraged to at least hopefully put the brakes on some of the ambitions of the right parties in the current government, or kind of shift to a new government in the next couple of years. You can also have economic anxieties happening. You can have economic repercussions. There are already economic repercussions from this new government. And one of the big concerns for many Israelis is rising housing costs. And yet houses in the West Bank are being subsidized by the government while they're having a hard time buying houses within the 67 borders. There could be a backlash to that changes the economic environment. And also, if you look even among the right, if you look at their priorities from polls in 2019, the most they're concerned with is maintaining a Jewish majority state. So at some point, many of the right have realized, and you would think that more on the right would realize, that the only way to retain a Jewish majority state is to have a two-state solution, because otherwise you don't have that option. And if you look at polls, those saying that their highest value is a greater land of Israel decreased from 19% to 15%. So some people on the right have multiple goals and values, but you see if they have to choose which value is most important, many of them will ultimately choose a Jewish majority state over a larger Israeli state. So that gives some hope for the future as well. You also can see, I won't get into all these polls, but a majority of Israelis are willing to be pragmatic about things like Jews not praying on Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mount in order to kind of avoid conflict. And those conditions often, when there's more conflict, lead to even more people resisting public officials wanting to visit the Temple Mount, as Minister Ben-Gvir recently did. And then finally, you look at US policy. And those of you who want to discuss that, we can discuss that. What, if anything, can the US do at this point? You've seen a flurry of US officials going to Israel, also visiting with the Palestinian Authority because of their own concern about things escalating and their own concern about challenges to Israel's democracy. So could you see greater active mediation? Maybe. Unfortunately, I'd be surprised, let's say, if Biden in the State of the Union speech tonight even mentions it. We'll see. I'm hopeful. Trying to get the parties to reiterate previous commitments to this framework that I've talked about. Day-to-day communication to try to prevent escalation, supporting possibly Palestinian elections and reconciliation among Fatah and Hamas possibly. Maybe before there's a talk about Netanyahu coming to Washington this month, maybe trying to get some commitments before laying out the red carpet for him, leveraging other foreign policy issues, right? I mean, there are all these other issues going on in terms of Ukraine, and the US wanting Israel to support Ukraine even more than it does. It gives some support, but it also has hesitated because Russia often is allowing it to curb Iranian influence in Syria next door to it, which it's concerned about. There's issues about Iran that they're all concerned about. So those are all contentious issues, but those issues might be leveraged in different ways in order to at least prevent things from getting even worse. And so leaving the door open for new leadership among Palestinians and new leadership among Israelis. So it's a pretty bleak moment, but I'm happy. I remain an eternal optimist. So I think there are also room for it's not a linear progression and things, although things could get worse, there's also potential, in the next decade for things to get back on track and make much more progress and hopefully reach a situation where there's a Palestinian state alongside Israel. But I welcome questions, challenges, critiques of any kind, and hopefully we can have a good discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Aronoff. If anyone would like to raise their hand to ask a question or put their questions in the chat, I'd like to open the floor up for questions. All right, we have one question in the chat here from Taz. Taz asks, you mentioned as part of the two-state solution, potentially individuals could choose where they live if they would want to come back. However, I think about the Great Migration after the partition of India, where thousands of lives were lost as Muslims and Hindus moved to Pakistan and India respectively. If both sides proceeded with this, is it likely that violence will decrease? I'm not sure we can hear anything from here. Sorry.
No, okay.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a great question. So again, what has been officially negotiated between 2000 and 2008, mainly off and on, a little bit in 2014 and 2016 in different ways, has been a two-state solution in which essentially Jews don't stay in Palestine, and in which the vast majority of Palestinian refugees don't return to Israel. So you essentially reify the partition, right? In order to have a partition that leads to two states. And I think the thinking there among, let's say, Palestinians perhaps, is that they're going to have a small state. They want to have an ethnically Palestinian state that privileges Palestinian return to the new state. So that's the main concern. And that secondly, they've had such a bad taste for settlements in the West Bank, obstructing their ability to establish a state. And then thirdly, there's a small percentage, but still a dangerous percentage of settlers who have engaged in violence with Palestinians in both ways. So those are reasons why Palestine up to now has not been eager to have Jews stay. And that if they stay and only have Palestinian citizenship, now they might be able to there possibly could be an opportunity for them to become Palestinian citizens, and not permanent residency, and lose their Israeli citizenship. Most wouldn't want to do that. Interestingly, in most surveys, the vast majority of Palestinian refugees do not want to return back to Israel proper within the 1967 border. So they want to have the right to do so, but they don't necessarily are going to do so. And there are a host of reasons why, but in Jordan, there are many Palestinians living in Jordan. Many of them have gotten Jordanian citizenship. Some of them have lived there for 3 generations, right? The king of Jordan is married to a Palestinian, and they don't necessarily want to leave Jordan. So that's just kind of one reason. Another reason is people might want to live in a majority Palestinian state and have self-determination that way. So to answer none of the official negotiations have had this idea of permanent residency in each other's countries. However, this confederation idea is getting a little more leverage, but still most Palestinians and Israelis don't know much about it and haven't really discussed it, has some creative ideas for this permanent residency in each other's countries, that you maintain the majority in terms of voting and other things. You retain the actual demographic majority, but there's a little more room. There's less of idea of complete partition and separation, and more of idea of continued collaboration as well within a 2-state framework. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. Any other questions?
Yes, we've got a couple more in the chat here. The next one comes from Kurt, who asks, are the members of the current Israeli government right-wing enough to actually discuss an attempt to rebuild a Jewish temple on Temple Mount al-Haram al-Sharif? Could this set off a civil war in Israel?
Yeah, no, that's an extremely dangerous idea. So up to now, no Israeli government, and certainly not Netanyahu himself, even though he's on the right, would ever contemplate rebuilding a temple. Now, someone like Ben Gvir or Smotrich very well would like to do so, and that's extremely dangerous because I think it could cause World War III or something, right? I mean, it just can't be done when there are beautiful mosques there now. That you would do that without humongous violent repercussions, not just among Israeli Palestinians, but at a much larger scale than that. So I don't think because it's still a minority, even the current government is not going to build a Temple Mount. There's no way the majority of Israelis are against it. Even the majority of the current government is against it. However, just the mere rhetoric about it, unfortunately, is provocative and could, as you could see in one of the, couple of the wars between Israel and Hamas was taking on the notion that now they're the vanguards of protecting Jerusalem and protecting Haram al-Sharif, and they had their own imam in the Haram al-Sharif, and they were kicking out the PA's imam and so forth. And Jordan also has jurisdiction over it. So certainly, I can't foresee any Israeli government trying to do this, but certainly the rhetoric itself can escalate tensions, could even lead to war between Israel and Hamas, could escalate intercommunal tensions within Israel. And so even if it's never done, the mere rhetoric about it is provocative and insightful and dangerous. So I think that's a concern on its own.
All right, we have another question in the chat here from Susan. She says, I have visited Israel and was surprised that the land being settled on the West Bank is barren desert. Will people continue to live there in such barren conditions?
Yeah, I mean, some of the Judean desert there is beautiful, but yes, I mean, like if you look at some cities like Ramallah, it's a relatively thriving city. It doesn't look barren, but a lot of the West Bank is the Judean desert, and whereas you could very well build beautiful Palestinian cities there in the future, it is desert. So why do some of the settlers want to live there? The settlers who live in the middle of the desert like that, most of the settlers aren't religious. They're there for economic reasons within a 10 minutes distance of Jerusalem. But the settlers who go to what they name Judea and Samaria are going there for religious reasons. They're going there because they think they're bringing on redemption of the Messiah. By the way, there are about 30 million, right, fundamentalist Christians who largely think the same, right, about the Jews need to come back there in order for Jesus to return and so forth. So they're there for religious reasons, and they're very tied to the land. They think all these biblical things happened in the land, and they feel very tied to it and close to it. So they don't, they're sufficiently motivated that they, some of them start basically putting up trailers and settlements that are illegal even by Israeli law, right? That Israel hasn't authorized them to build them. They'll put up trailers and live in conditions that maybe initially some others wouldn't want to choose, but for them, they're religiously and ideologically motivated and hoping that then they can turn it into a town or city, right? And then you do have settlements there that look like towns and cities and have their own schools and synagogues and swimming pools and live in much better conditions than those kinds of trailers. So it depends. And I think, unfortunately, the Israeli government still subsidizes, not the unauthorized settlements, but the authorized settlements it subsidizes as well. So, I mean, those particular people are ideologically and religiously motivated.
Do you want to?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the younger people are are less accommodating than the older people, both among Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Tragically, I think part of the reason may be is that they, some of them grew up post Second Intifada, where you never had kind of as much serious peace negotiations that they'd hoped for. They don't remember the time when there were relatively more exchanges and familiarity between Israelis and Palestinians, so they have engaged in demonizing one another. Also in the, if you look at the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish population in Israel, because they have many more kids, demographically, they're getting larger. So even within Israel, it's projected that kindergartens, I don't know, 20 years from now, the half, at least half of the population are going to be Palestinians and Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. So there's a demographic trend, and those ultra-Orthodox Jews live in more insular communities. And so maybe, have more threatened images of Palestinians, and the same thing with young Palestinians. They are more disaffected from the Palestinian Authority's cooperation with Israel, from not having still gained in a Palestinian state, from in the West Bank still living under the occupation. So unfortunately, the younger generation, among both populations, is less accommodating. So on one hand, that's, deeply concerning, of course. On the other hand, we always have to keep in mind that opinions shift as well. So when there are signs of real hope and there are real leaders, then opinions can and do shift. So for instance, you see them have shifted pretty negatively just in the last 2 years, right? But on the other hand, let's say before Anwar Sadat came to Israel in the late 70s, he came to Jerusalem. Most Israelis said that they were against returning the Sinai for peace with Egypt. They felt like the Sinai gave Israel strategic depth. Israel was surprised in October 1973 with Egypt and Syria's attack against it. They thought if you have the strategic depth of the Sinai, you won't be surprised by a future attack. At least that was part of the thinking then. And so they opposed land for peace in terms of the Sinai. Once Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem and said, then Israeli opinion shifted overnight practically, and people were so thrilled and overjoyed, and the vast majority then supported returning the Sinai and Israeli-Egyptian peace. So again, we have to take these polls extremely seriously, but they're also affected by a variety of different conditions, which could change in the future as well. Yeah.
All right, we have one question in the chat here from Dr. Waller. He asks, can you talk about the demographics inside Israel? How fast is the non-Jewish population there growing?
So as it's a good question. So as I mentioned, it is growing. So right now, about 21% of the Israeli population is Arab Israeli, which is mostly the vast majority Palestinian citizens of Israel. You also have a small population of Druze that serve in the Israeli, all of whom serve in the Israeli, all the men who serve in the Israeli military since 1948. You also have a Bedouin population, which traditionally didn't really identify themselves as Palestinian, but increasingly are starting to identify as Palestinian as well. So the vast majority are Palestinian. The majority are Muslim, and a smaller percent are Christian. Traditionally, the Muslim Palestinian citizens of Israel had more children than the non-Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish children Israel. The Christians have about the same. Christian Palestinians is the same, as basically as often as in many countries, tied to educational levels and things like that. And as there's been educational mobility in Israel, you also see Palestinian citizens of Israel having fewer children as well. That being said, again, if you project the demographics into the future, the secular and traditional Jews become relatively smaller, and the Muslim Palestinians and ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews become relatively larger. So it's interesting to see what effects that might have in terms of society and politics in the future. On one hand, that has the potential to lead towards greater polarization and cleavage. On the other hand, you have some interesting possibilities for coalitions and collaborations. If you look at the Israeli government before the most recent one, you had a Palestinian Muslim political party, Israeli political party called Ra'am, which was an Islamist Muslim party, which was in coalition with Jewish Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox parties in Netanyahu's government before that, right? And so, and what they're all thinking is, and there are some alignments, there are differences among them, but there are also some alignments in terms of resources from the state they want from their own communities, in terms of relative autonomy for religious authorities within their own communities, etc. So again, like in many situations, you don't have just one trend, you have simultaneous opposing things that have happened that are both on one hand more polarizing and on the other hand allowing for greater collaborations. And even with Palestinian Israelis themselves, you have trends in which they both feel more Israeli and more Palestinian over time. So their Palestinian nationalism increases, but also their sense of being Israeli increases. And so you think they'd be at odds, but again, we're all individuals and communities and states are full of contradictions, or not necessarily contradictions, but have these multiple identities that work in different ways, right? So it's not just one prediction one can make from that. Yeah.
We can't hear.
I will repeat the question when she's done. So it's a long question, so I'll give I'll give a quick summary for those who are on Zoom and couldn't hear you. You were saying that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has increasingly engaged in going into the West Bank with Israeli troops over the past few months to go after people who he thinks are planning attacks or have planned attacks, right? This happened last week with 9 Palestinians being killed, 8 were what Israel describes as being part of militant organizations that were armed. 1 was an elderly woman who was innocent, right? In the next week, 7 Jewish Israeli civilians were killed coming out of their synagogue and so forth, right? So you have on one hand this increased involvement in the West Bank, right? Which is leading to violence and which is weakening the Palestinian Authority, right? And on the other hand, you were saying there is a lot of protests in Israel, including, for those of you who don't know, Israel has the most startups of any country in the world per capita. It has been extremely successful with entrepreneurship and research innovation and so forth. And she was saying that they pay a big portion of Israeli taxes, and they're striking because they're all very opposed to the current government and concerned about it. So, but the main question was, given all this, right, what can or should the US do? And I think that Biden coming in was always a strong supporter of Israel, even though he is relatively far more empathetic to the Palestinian cause than was Trump. I think Trump, really was it was terrible in terms of trying to move things forward because he basically, cut off all kinds of things for the Palestinians, punished them. His peace plan wasn't any serious attempt to get to a two-state solution and so forth. So Biden has returned to the pre-Trump kind of policies, very supportive of Israel, but also since April 2021, he's given $500 million to the Palestinian Authority. So he's trying to do that. Now, I think traditionally his philosophy has been, I'll be able to have more influence if I try to influence things privately as opposed to publicly. And so I think most of what he seems to be doing through his Secretary of State has been there and has left two people in the area. His National Security Advisor has been there. The Director of CIA has been there and so forth. As I think most of it, the challenges are in private, but some things have also gone public in terms of publicly saying, you can't build new settlements, you can't authorize settlements that your own government has opposed, and you should at the very least have dialogue, since so many people are against these new attempts to weaken the high court. You should at least have dialogue about it. So some of the things have become public. So as I said, I mean, it's a real challenge. I certainly think they have to be more active than they've been. Unfortunately, it's not the highest priority for Biden if he wants to run for re-election. It's a contentious issue that the Republicans will capitalize on. There are other priorities that he has, but I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of keeping the pressure on the ground to make sure that, okay, even if today Netanyahu decided not to demolish a Bedouin community of 250 people that's between Jerusalem and the West Bank, but make sure he doesn't do it next week or 3 weeks later when you don't have, so just be, continue the constant vigilance to make sure that things aren't implemented in a worse fashion is one thing. Another thing is to go beyond that, because otherwise you're just kind of keeping things from trying to get worse, but you're not actually trying to move things in the right direction. So again, even with the new government, putting some pressure on to really kind of abide by previous governments. Some of the philosophy, leverage the Abraham Accords, right? Because the Abraham Accords are against Israel annexing anything. So the UAE that normalized relations with Israel did in the Security Council criticize Israel. You can leverage, as I said, Saudi Arabia and improving relations with that. I mean, people have talked about leveraging Iran. I have mixed feelings about that. But, certainly the Biden administration and Israel become increasingly concerned about Iran because they haven't gone back to their previous nuclear agreement and are helping Russia and Ukraine and are repressing their own people in demonstrations. So there's increased focus on Iran. I'm still very hesitant about getting into conflict with Iran and the dangers of that. So, but some people are talking about, okay, leveraging kind of Iran to get Israel to make changes on the Israeli-Palestinian front, or at least, that's a dangerous game as well, but you can do it maybe in other issue areas as well. trying to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't, make things as partisan as he did previously when he came to Washington and so forth. So I think that there are a lot of things the U.S. can do, even on a day-to-day basis, with its economic cooperation, intelligence cooperation, military cooperation. Those things are continuing, right? Israel and the U.S. had thousands of soldiers engage in kind of trainings in the Mediterranean in the face of what could happen with Iran. So there are all these things that they're doing in cooperation with each other. But I certainly think that a lot more pressure could come to bear. That doesn't necessarily mean always with a harsh stick, but a combination of public and private, because there are so many Israelis. I mean, Biden could indirectly help the opposition to the new government in various ways as well. So those are some starting things, but it's certainly a huge challenge, right, in terms of what you could do. I'm sure there are other things that the U.S. can do as well. Yeah. Yeah.
We have some more questions in the chat here. Let's see. The next one comes from the Ferguson Miller Party. They ask, how would the residents of Gaza respond to a TSS?
Yeah, so so I mean, there is a division of opinion among Palestinians in Gaza, just like there is within the West Bank, and just as there is among Jewish Israelis. So often, in the past, it's been about 30% of residents of Gaza on and off that have supported Hamas. And while the polls I was looking at from December, I was giving the total polls that include the West Bank and Gaza. When I was also looking at differentiations between the West Bank and Gaza, there are some differentiations, but not necessarily overly dramatic ones. So you do have some support among Gaza residents for a two-state solution. I don't have the exact percentage with me here. But I would suspect it's about 30% as well. And you're not allowed really to support Fatah and the Gaza anymore, right? As you recall, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, it kind of took over by force and pushed people out of seventh floor windows, apartment buildings, tortured people, killed people that supported Fatah. You're not, there have been attempts at reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, but also one of the reasons that Mahmoud Abbas has had security cooperation with Israel is that he feels threatened by Hamas himself. So I think there is some, just because Hamas rules Gaza doesn't mean Hamas is reflective of what all residents of Gaza actually thinks, right? So so there certainly is some support for a two solution there as well, and a lot of disaffection from both. The poll in December 2022 was saying that over 80% of Palestinians think the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, and about 65% think Hamas is corrupt. So again, they're not. They also have open eyes and a qualified support for these parties, and also some dissatisfaction with them as well. Yeah.
Are there
I'm
any
happy
more questions
to
in the
take other questions.
Robertson room? If not, we have a couple more questions in the chat here. All right, well, in the chat here, Dave Olson asks, what is life like in the settlements, working, shopping, recreation, schooling, practicing religion? And what about rocket attacks in settlements? Are they more susceptible to attack?
Well, I haven't visited as many settlements, and I think there's kind of variation among the settlements. So I think, some settlements, they really have their own communities, certainly in those blocks like Ma'ale Adumim outside of Israel with 80,000 people. It's like its own kind of city, where they have, everything one would have in a city and live relatively well, there. You have, I think, others that are more within that. There's really variation, I think, among settlements, from what I understand, within the West Bank in terms of some being more prosperous, others really not. They also, some of them have security concerns, right? Where sometimes different groups try to attack settlers and cars on their roads or in their communities. And then you have some settlers who are attacking Palestinians, destroying olive harvests, olive trees that Palestinians have, and so forth. So you have, different experiences among different settlers. I don't think that most of the settlers are, in the greatest danger from rocket attacks that are from Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. So there have been, over 12,000 rockets that have been fired indiscriminately at Israeli civilians in 2008 and 2011 and 2012 and 2014 and 2021. And there would be far more Israeli casualties if they didn't have bomb shelters that practically every building is required to have, and if they didn't have an Iron Dome system that can intervene with rockets that are being targeted at various places in Israel. So, but the communities that are most affected by that are not necessarily in the West Bank, because usually Hamas and Islamic Jihad aren't targeting communities in the West Bank. They're targeting within the 67 border, most of the communities on the Gaza border, like Sderot, who have it's too close to Gaza for the Iron Dome to work for them. But the rockets now can reach, as you know, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other places. So it's really the people on the border, Gaza border, that have been most traumatized by it. So often they have 15 seconds to get to a bomb shelter. It could be 2 a.m. They have 3 kids. They have to get the 3 kids within 20 seconds. A huge portion of the children have different kinds of PTSD from the experience. And of course, I think for people in Gaza, it's even worse, with the people being killed, because Hamas doesn't spend the money on, and the money they get from Qatar for it, they don't spend the money on bomb shelters, and so forth. And so, and they're firing near or within civilian areas. So you have more people getting killed, and the kids in Gaza are traumatized. I mean, none of us would want to trade shoes with people living in Gaza and the trauma that they have undergone through multiple wars, which is even worse with, people they know who've lost lives and so forth. So, your heart goes out to this, for this. And that's why the ultimate solution, really, in my mind, is a peace agreement that leads to a 2-state solution. And even though there'll be people on both sides who oppose it, I think it will weaken opposition to it and moderate opposition to it once it's established, because otherwise, this violence will be endless, and it's really has a traumatic effect. And I think many Israelis and Palestinians of different degrees in different ways, but it's not the settlers in the West Bank, although you can get the settlement like the Ma'ale Adumim that gets rockets, but generally the rockets are not targeting settlements in the West Bank. Anybody here have any questions or anything that was confusing?
If you have time, I know there's one more.
Yes, we have.
Just stay here as long as people would like.
We have one more in the chat from Nancy. Nancy asks, in a recent interview, Netanyahu seemed to be inviting Washington to use him as a mediator with Russia in ending the war in Ukraine. Washington has not seemed to jump at the offer. Is there a danger in him becoming the mediator, for example, expanding his power?
Yeah, I mean, that has been in the air, that also previous to him, that the previous Israeli Prime Minister Lieberman, Bennett might be part of negotiation. So that's been floating in the air, in the sense that, Israel also has a relationship with Russia. About 1 million Jews, when they were finally, Russia let them leave Russia, left for Israel and emigrated to Israel. Some Russians, go on vacation in Israel, and you have some stores and newspapers and media in Russian. You have, certain other common interests. So, it's a possibility. I don't think it's a likely possibility, because as I said, basically Russia has become more supportive of Iran recently, and so that also makes it more challenging for an Israeli prime minister to try to reach out to Russia more. The U.S. And others are putting more pressure on Israel to be even more pro-Ukraine, even though Israel's concerned about the repercussions from Russia and Syria. So, it's a possibility that he could play some role, but I don't know if it's necessarily a likelihood that would happen. Yeah.
All right, well, with that wraps up our session for today. Dr. Aronoff, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with us your research. Our next speaker will be Dr. Amy Simon, who will be presenting on empathy in Holocaust studies. And that will be 2 weeks from now.
She's amazing, by the way, so you'll want to come back for her. She won the MSU Teacher Scholar Award last year. She's a fantastic professor, so I really recommend coming to hear her. And I'll stick around if anybody has any remaining questions in person here. I'm happy to try to answer any. I don't always have all the answers, but at least I can try to navigate what other questions we could be asking. So thanks, and I hope everyone has a good evening, and I desperately hope for opportunities for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I always say I'm going to throw the biggest party ever when during my lifetime there will be peace. You'll all be invited to that party.